right now, in some ways, as the world has ever been. But in particular in America, I think we're seeing a turn of events that is many of us questioning many of the presuppositions we might have moved through the world with. And Zen loves to navigate those things. We don't really rely on dogma, we rely on dialectical engagement with our lives and with one another. That's what defines the Zen tradition. So broadly, Zen is a school of Buddhism. This word Zen is Japanese. It's what we've come to commonly know the tradition by in the English-speaking world. The Japanese simply came to America and to Great Britain first. They had missionaries that were coming out and speaking at the World Parliament of Religions and things like this before a lot of other Buddhist voices from this particular stream. But it should be known that the word Zen is the transliteration. So in other words, if we trace back the word, we get the Sanskrit origin. This is an Indic religion, a Buddhist religion. The word is John. Sometimes it looks like it's spelled Dhyana. You'll see it today, but it's pronounced John. So when John moved across the Himalayas and into China, it became known as Chan, which is really where the school took off and became its own thing. And then it moved into Korea, where it became Son, and Japan, where it became Zen, and Vietnam, where it became Chen. So we see this school of Buddhist thinking and practice really alive in East Asia and to some degree Southeast Asia. But it's broadly speaking belongs to the Mahayana school of Buddhism. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Buddhism, or as familiar as maybe we need to be to talk about a heretical subschool, Buddhism originates about 2,500 years ago in what we know to be modern day Nepal, with a man by the name of Siddhartha Gautama, who most of the Buddhist speaking world calls Shakyamuni Buddha, the sage of the Shakya clan. And this is a person that was probably the son of a chieftain. Sometimes our hagiography gets a bit inflated and we talk about the Buddha as a prince with great wealth and a large kingdom that he was heir apparent to, but we know that historically that's a little bit inflated. So this was a gentleman that was slated to take over his father's chiefdom, if you will. And as such, he was treated like the son of a chief, like a prince, as we sometimes say in the hagiography, and shielded from all of the world's woes. That's how the story goes. But eventually, as he became an adult and needed to be engaged in the world and perhaps meeting and intermingling with the folks he was supposed to be chief over, he engaged the world and found some disturbing things. Largely, he saw sick people, he saw dead people, he saw suffering, toiling people, and even a dead body, which perhaps was new to this young man. And this sent him on a spiritual quest. Now, Buddhism just didn't appear out of anywhere. It's broadly speaking a reform of Vedic religion. In English, we often say Hinduism broadly, but there is no religion that is Hinduism, really. There's a whole class of religion that falls under that umbrella or banner. And in India, Buddhism fits there too. It's been sort of reabsorbed, if you will, into the Vedic traditions. So we need to understand Buddhism is not something that just pops up in a singular event and becomes a unique tradition unto itself, but as something that evolved out of Hindu thinking or Vedic thinking. It's something of a reformation, if you will. In fact, when you look at any of the words that Buddhism used to define its fundamental tenets, like karma, like even our core teaching of dukkha or moksha, liberation, these are themes that come up in Hinduism frequently. They're borrowed words, they're not new. So what makes Buddhism separate from Hinduism? Well, fundamentally, we remember that the Buddha studied with what we would call Hindu teachers or Jain teachers. There's some evidence that this gentleman, Siddhartha Gautama, might have studied with the last Jain saint, Mahavira. In fact, many of our precepts and practices are directly translated from that tradition. But if we look at what the Reformation really entailed, what Buddha was dissatisfied with that finally allowed him to come into his own as a spiritual voice and a leader that would become world-renowned, it's this notion of selfhood. You see, in Hinduism broadly, there's an idea that a soul is born into the material world as separate from God. The lives that we're all living here with these fleshy bodies are fundamentally problematic. Buddha shares this worldview. We call it dukkha, suffering, unsatisfactoriness. And so the goal for a Hindu, again, if you'll allow me to keep using that turn of phrase, is to move through their life or lives through transmigration of the soul, reincarnation, taking control of their karma, which is to say, it's a short form of karma vipaka, cause and effect, and eventually re-enjoin God. So each individual body is a soul, And the soul is part and parcel to the Paramatma, the super soul or God, the formless, everywhere present, complete nature or essence of reality. And these things are seeking union or perhaps reunion. We sometimes talk about yoga in Buddhism and Hinduism. And this is a word that's related to the English word yoke, which is to join, right? So these dharmic religions are about rejoining or enjoining ourselves to our lives as they are already in progress or perhaps were. But Buddha couldn't find any evidence for this fundamental soul that moves through this transmigratory process to re-enjoin God. And this was his fundamental quandary. So eventually he postulates that maybe, just maybe, if we take that away, instead of our fundamental being having a soul or a selfhood, maybe fundamentally we are not soul or not self. So the one word or concept that we don't borrow from Hinduism, the reforming linchpin, if you will, is anatma, fundamental lack of selfhood. And above all else, I think that's what defines Buddhism and Zen as a unique religious tradition. In Zen, we sometimes say that we make a lot of assumptions about our life, and this is where our suffering is rooted. We go around the world with this problematic I word. We don't even have to make a big metaphysic about souls. We'll just keep it material. I, my, me. And we make so many assumptions around this concept that's rather amorphous, but central to our being and the way we interact as individuals. You know, this again begins with the word I. But if we look closely, if we examine that assumption of I-ness, it tends to fall apart under scrutiny. And I think we know this linguistically, if we just pay a little bit of extra attention. And by the way, this word Zen, this is what it's all about. The Sanskrit word Jan means concentration, attention. So Zen is always paying a little bit more attention to the things that we perhaps overlook and uncovering the wisdom that's perhaps right beneath our gaze or right beneath our feet even. So if we pay a little bit of attention to this concept of I-ness, we know linguistically that the I-ness, the self, is not the body. Why? Because we can say it is my body. For instance, I was eating dinner yesterday and somehow took a bite on something too hard and broke a tooth. So if I start slurring my speech, you know what's going on. This my tooth, right? I am not the tooth is not me, it is mine, which is part of my body. The body is not me, it is mine. Every part of the body is that way. So we can say, okay, well, what about the brain? Well, we know the gray matter is my brain. And we even know the thoughts, the more amorphous, ethereal construct that is consciousness that seems to come out of this union of electricity and matter is also not me. It's mine, my thoughts, my opinions, my ideas. And in fact, I can take them to the US Patent and Trademark Office and submit an application, and I can prove to you with governmental force that indeed they in fact belong to me. And if you use them, I can sue you for more of my money, right? So if we're not this body, if we're not this brain, if we're not this idea, if we even talk about our soul as a possession, my soul that needs salvation, for instance, we know that somewhere this I exists, but not in anything that we can identify. Where am I? Who am I? What is this life? These are the fundamental questions that define the Zen tradition. And as you might be able to imagine, it's not an easy thing to simply answer, right? We can give dogmatic answers, but they tend to be just that. When we put them under the scrutiny of jhana, of Zen itself, they also tend to fall apart. So the Zen answer is very simple. It comes in three parts. Sit down, quiet down, and pay attention. And maybe in this profound space of paying attention and watching the patterns and rhythms of our lives, we can come to an experiential understanding of what this I-ness infers or implies or points toward. It's interesting when Zen really became a tradition and solidified as an independent Buddhist school in China, merging with many native, we might even say animistic traditions along the way, the transliteration, we had to start utilizing Chinese characters from Sanskrit Devanagari script as we use today. And Chinese is a logograph or pictographic language. So each portion of a character represents a whole concept or idea. And the array of characters that the Chinese put together to pronounce this word Chan is really interesting. One side of the character means to actualize, to materialize, and the other means oneness or singularity. So in a way, etymologically, Zen means to become one. So to take this disparate self and its concepts of where it exists and settle down with all the mental process and materialize a unitary state of being that is perhaps not separate from the eyes and that are used everywhere else in the world and the universe. So we find ourselves situated in this sentient experience or concept, if you will, generally speaking. And somehow in Zen, we postulate that that brings cessation to some of the primal wounds of being. And in Zen, we would talk about this primal wound of being as self-awareness itself, knowing that I am somehow an individual, that perhaps I'm somehow related or relational to other beings, but not really having a definitive understanding of what that means, and therefore not a definitive understanding of how to utilize that to move through the world in a way that is harmonious with the rhythms of nature and the greater sense of being itself. So perhaps dialectically now we're alluding to what the Zen tradition is about in its various schools. It's difficult to speak about Buddhism as a whole or even Zen as a whole because I sometimes tell people we've had 500 years longer than Christianity to fracture and create denominations and sub-schools of thought. So if you can imagine trying to speak about Christianity is difficult, trying to speak about Buddhism or Hinduism or even Zen is difficult as well. But generally, Zen is in this arena of not delving too deeply into solid doctrines that fall apart under the scrutiny of our meditative inquiry, but materializing oneness in an experiential way. And so Zen navigates the problems of our world perhaps uniquely because we're not always referencing source texts or scripture or past thinkers. We're always engaging the world as it's appearing before our eyes and beneath our feet, and being relationally engaged and discerning from moment to moment to moment how to be in a way that is helpful, if you can allow me to use that word. So that was probably a lot at once. You know, I'm sitting in New York visiting my family right now, and I sometimes get criticized for speaking at the speed of a New Yorker. So if this has been a bit quick, I'd like to check for understanding, engage if everybody's following, and maybe we can start having some conversation around what this interesting tradition is.
Does anyone have any questions or comments at this point that they'd like to put forward? Feel free to ask directly. You'll just have to unmute yourself.
Oh, we've got some coming through the chat, it looks like here.
I have one.
Oh, go ahead, Beverly.
I have one question. I've often heard of practicing Zen. So if I were to say practice it, even though I'm not a Buddhist, what would be the procedure?
That's a great question, which kind of brings us to the foundation of Zen as a religious tradition. Zen is not defined in any sort of way by belief or subscription to a particular doctrine. It's defined, as are actually many religions, by what we do, by what we practice. So to say we practice Zen is to say we practice attentiveness within a particular container. Sometimes you'll see the word zazen, which means sitting Zen. If you ever see an image of the Buddha, it's always in some meditative position. You know, there's some other iconography that is doing other things and it's more engaged, but Buddha is usually meditating in some kind of way. So the core discipline of Zen is usually thought to be this quiet contemplation in a particular seated position. Now, some schools of Zen are very particular that means having 3 points of contact with the ground, 2 knees and you're behind on a cushion, with your hands in a particular mudra or seal, with your eyes open, not closed, focusing about 45-degree angle downward on nothing in particular, and through a number of different methodologies, clearing your mind so that you can eventually inquire of the direct nature of mind. So to do that practice doesn't, again, involve any particular belief or subscription or rejection of anything. So Zen is a particularly portable tradition. We find Jewish adherents practicing Zen. We find Catholic adherents, even priests and monks practicing Zen. We find non-religious or otherwise atheistic persons practicing Zen, sitting meditation. I come from a school of Zen called Rinzai, which again is built around the core discipline of actually engaging a teacher, a Zen master, if you will. And one of the things that we do is examine case studies in our meditation, which are called koans. It's K-O-A-N-S. So sometimes people read that and think koans, but koan. And we have a number of these collections that my digital background doesn't want to show you, that are cases between students and teachers since the Tang Dynasty in China, engaging big questions and coming to realization. So that sitting with these seemingly riddles or case studies of the tradition in that meditative way is also a part of the practice in some schools. So what it means to practice Zen is to sit down, to quiet down, and to pay attention for prolonged periods of time. And Zen, we like to do that for about 30 minutes at a time at least. But as you go along, if you were to do a Zen retreat, you might be meditating for 10 to 15 hours a day, interspersed with short periods of walking. So it's a fairly rigorous, very physical practice, actually. And that's something that gets lost sometimes, that this is a very somatic practice. It involves the body in a big way. And this is sort of, by the way, formalized martial arts are sometimes related to the Shaolin Temple in China, with this character Bodhidharma, who was the founder of the Zen tradition. And the reason that's related to the Shaolin Temple is because Zen has always had a physical culture. We would say you have to train the body to some degree in order to train the mind to make this particular type of inquiry to come to realization or awakening or enlightenment, as we sometimes problematically say. I would offer that we practice Zen to come to moksha, which is to say liberation, to some degree of freedom and peace and equipoise in our lives. So that's what it means to practice Zen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it looks like a couple questions have come through the chat. The first one was from Jay. Can you give us an idea of how Buddhism changed as it migrated?
Sure, that's a good question. So there's really three movements in Buddhism, although arguably today we can say four, and the fourth one would be the Zen tradition. Again, I've mentioned briefly that we're considered something of a heretical sect by many Buddhists, but I think under scrutiny, again, we like to put things under the lens of meditative scrutiny, we find that that's not so true. But we can look at Buddhism in India as being, today we would say Theravada is the name, which means the way of the elders. It's the orthodox Buddhist school that's as close to what Shakyamuni Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama taught as we know. It follows the scriptures very closely. That school is very much marcated by monastic practice, which is to say, professing a particular set of precepts for a container of living in a day-to-day life, which involves, among other things, celibacy, not handling money, only eating one meal a day, not attending entertainments or shows, not sleeping on high beds, lots of little details. There's in fact 250 precepts that monks take. And that's the primary practice. It's a monastic practice that is supported by a lay constituency. And the idea in Theravada is if you can't renounce the world and become a monk, then the best thing you can do is support the monks. And in your next lifetime, your next incarnation of thought into a body, you can perhaps become a monk too. You can plant these seeds of cause and effect. So that's Orthodox Buddhism. It's a monastic container for practicing meditation with the hopes that you can attain liberation, briefly. What happens when Buddhism starts moving out of the Indus River Valley, we find that these precepts that the Buddha laid out, and by the way, the Buddha was what I would call an occasional theologian. He wasn't a systematic theologian. He didn't lay things out from the beginning in a very dogmatic, organized way. He taught on the basis of questions dialectically. So something would happen, someone would inquire of the Buddha about it, he'd make a rule or make a comment, and these became the sutras and the precepts to some degree. So as some of these precepts were starting to be engaged, especially after the Buddha's lifetime, and the area wider than the Indus River Valley and cultures that were not, congruent or tit for tat even with that from which the Buddha came, questions started arising about how do I follow this practice in a social, political, physical environment that doesn't support it. So this becomes what we know as the Mahayana tradition. In fact, one of the first major splits from Theravada, the way of the elders, to Mahayana, the greater or bigger vehicle, is what it literally means, is around the issue of using money and living by alms alone, which is what Theravada monks are expected to do. And gradually this becomes a much more major, if you'll allow me, theological, philosophical problem, where we start seeing, well, maybe I don't just practice Buddhism for my own liberation, for my own stepping out of suffering, but somehow my practicing of meditation is related to finding liberation and well-being for all people, for all sentient beings. This becomes the second movement. And really then, as we pass into the Himalayas and start engaging some of the indigenous cultures along the regions of Mongolia, Tibet, etc., we start picking up animistic traditions like Bon, native shamanism. And we have this interesting tradition called Vajrayana, the way of the thunderbolt or lightning bolt. And I sometimes compare these Christian traditions in this way. Theravada, or original Buddhism, can be thought of as Orthodox Christianity, perhaps the Catholic tradition, if you'll allow me to utilize that. And as you go and evolve a little bit and become the Mahayana, well, this is sort of the Protestant Reformation that turns things on its head, still maintains a strong connection to the core life and teaching of the Buddha, but is now interpreted in a much broader way. And then as we become this third movement, which is really known today in Tibet and Mongolia, the Vajrayana, that's kind of like Santeria in a way. In fact, for many years in the early study of world religion, Tibetan Buddhism, Mongolian Buddhism was not known as Buddhism at all to Western scholars. So for whatever that means, we called it Lamaism in the West. It was considered a completely separate religion. And it wasn't until we had better methods of inquiring into the nature of the tradition that we realized, no, this is legitimately an evolution of Buddhism and a school of Buddhism that has just picked up some additional accoutrements. And so then as we move from the Himalayas into China, China was a really big defining part of the Mahayana tradition. And we develop Zen, and we develop very strongly a Pure Land devotional school as well. So that's kind of a broad overview. And what happens as we evolve is people get further and further away from the ideal of enlightenment. And Theravada, the ideal, the original teaching, the idea is that you attain enlightenment, and that's the goal of Buddhism. Well, in the Mahayana, it's like, well, maybe now I'm just going to control my karma, live a good life, have a better rebirth, much more resembling its Vedic ancestry in many ways. And then eventually we get into China, and not only are we doing shamanistic ritual, but we're also being devoted to images of the Buddha, to Buddhas even. We now have a pantheon of characters that exist in some reality or plane above our own, the asuras, the heavenly realms. And Zen kind of returns it to the ground, in so much as where we can hold all of those things, but also realize that the primary goal for any practitioner is to become themselves a Buddha. Not just an enlightened being, but an actual Buddha on par with Shakyamuni, the founder of their religion. So that's in a nutshell.
Thank you. There are two more that have come in the chat. The first is from Dorothy. How can I use Zen to help someone who is blind and suffering right now, crying out for someone to help her?
That's great. So in Zen, we haven't let go of this Mahayana ideal of also practicing for other people. We do sometimes get a reputation for being, I don't know, a little bit self-involved, if you will, because we are practicing at the end of the day to wake up, to have enlightenment or liberation in our own lives. But we also realize when we investigate that selfhood issue that I brought up earlier, that really when we look closely, we tend to find, and I won't articulate a dogmatic standpoint or perspective, we tend to find that our bodies, our lives are not so far removed or different from those of other people. One of these archetypal figures that came out of the transmission of Zen across the Himalayas and into China especially is this character of Kuan Yin, or Avalokiteshvara. And the Chinese transliteration of this name of this quasi-deity, if you will, this bodhisattva, is one who perceives the sounds of the cries of the world, with the implication of doing something about it. And in Zen, we don't just revere these sort of characters as external deities that we can pray to and have something happen. There are schools of devotional Buddhism that practice that way, but we look to embody that characteristic of, through our attentiveness, paying close attention to the world, hearing the cries, the suffering of the world, and responding to that in some way. Now in Zen, we don't define how that has to be done. We leave that up to the relationship, the dialectical exchange of information and experience in your own life. This has been an interesting question in recent days and weeks about how should a Buddhist monk or a Zen practitioner be involved or not involved with protest? And shouldn't we just have some meditative equipoise and sit and watch the world go by? And you'll see a variety of perspectives that I would say are actually all legitimate. In Zen, we have a doctrine called two truths, which is essentially that there's the relative existence that we all live in, and there's the absolute existence that we all live in. And in the absolute existence, it's almost a metaphysical existence. It's this reality in which there are no legitimate differences or separations between people. If anybody's suffering, I'm suffering, but also if anybody is awake and delivered and liberated, all beings are awake and delivered and liberated. And both of these perspectives are prone to being, I would say, abused. And they become abused when they become stoic, when they become disengaged. Buddhism is always about engaging this moment. But we also have to realize our limitations. So if we take the other perspective that the relative world is suffering and I need to be involved in it as somebody that has gained some degree of separation from it to help deliver others. And as we know, being involved in social justice work, you can easily get burnt out if you don't have some sort of grounding that allows you to realize that also things are as they are is just enough. And there's something to be done about it. And that these are always held in mutual tension. So the short answer is, when you have a friend that's suffering, reach out, do whatever you can, do whatever is in your power, but also realize that none of us have the power to deliver the world other than through our practice of realizing things as they are being enough. That's the liberated perspective. So in Zen, we wouldn't dictate anything. We would ask you to converse with your experience and your reality and find what makes the most sense.
The next question in the chat from David. Does Zen have anything to say about specific collective problems that the human race has beyond meditate and detach from Maya, which you sort of just touched on a little bit?
So I think it would be helpful at this point to talk about the foundational teaching of Buddhism itself. Some Zen teachers would say that this is not really relevant to our practice because, again, it's always dialectical. It's always about your meditation experience in this moment. But the Zen school of Buddhism is indeed a school of Buddhism, and Buddhism is founded on 4 principles. These are called the Four Noble Truths, and they're simply 4 words in Sanskrit that we have to extrapolate quite a bit more in English. So for something to be called Buddhism, most Buddhists would agree, we see the world and the human experience through the lens of dukkha. Dukkha is a Sanskrit word that's sometimes translated as suffering. We've gotten a bad rap as a nihilistic bunch for saying perhaps that all life is suffering. That's not what we're saying. Etymologically, this first tenet of Buddhism means a wheel that binds. So in other words, if you have a cart that has 3 wheels or even 2, it doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It doesn't mean you can't accomplish anything. It doesn't mean that you don't go along, but it means things are not as we would have them be. There's sticking points that create struggle, that create strife, that create difficulty. So this is the first observation that the Buddha has in defining his own tradition above and beyond that not self thing I mentioned earlier. It doesn't stop there. The second noble truth is how this suffering happens, how the wheels get stuck. And the Buddha really identified 2 parts of this. Sometimes it's simply translated as attachment, which is where this detachment that the question is talking about comes from. But that's not really an accurate understanding of samudaya either, which is the word, the causes and causation, the causes and roots of suffering or unsatisfactoriness. Really what the Buddha is saying, that our wheels get stuck in our lives because we see things fundamentally as they are not. So life involves suffering to a degree, unsatisfactoriness to a degree, binding wheels to a degree, because we treat it in a way other than it is. So what is things as they are? In Buddhism, we would have 3 more words, anicca, anatta, and dukkha, again, which means impermanence and insubstantiality. In other words, everything in this material world that the Hindus define as problematic for similar reasons is prone to coming into existence, having some stability, entering into a period of decline and eventual dissolution, where the aggregate parts that give us form, that give us matter, that give us things we can interact with materially, come apart. Everything does. Physicists postulate that someday the sun will exhaust its energy and explode into a supernova. This is exponential reality, and envelop everything we've ever known and thought to be important as human beings. So on a very real scale, from a minute perspective of flies having a 24-hour lifespan, to the universe itself being in this same creative, sustaining decline and dissolution cycle is what is problematic. And it's problematic because we don't treat it that way. We treat impermanent things as if they are permanent, as if they have selfhood that is substantial, that is persisting, that goes on. And therefore, when reality illumines itself to be as it is through change, through age, through decline and dissolution, the suffering comes up. You know, I thought that I would have my eyesight and my hearing forever, and now that it's entering in decline or perhaps has gone away, I can't function and I'm suffering because I didn't treat it as it was, a temporary passing phenomena. And we do this with everything. We do this with not only everything about our body, but within our relationships in life. We get into romantic relationships and we assume that these things will persist forever, very frequently. In the US in particular, we have great ideas and films and books about romance, this everlasting, undying love where you never get tired of another person and no one ever dies and happily ever after into the sunset. We very typically don't engage the realities of what that looks like. I also think of Western funeral processes where when somebody dies, we immediately cover them up with a sheet. We put them in a black bag and refrigerate them so that when the corpse is brought out, we see the person makeup and pumped full of preservatives to seem as though nothing has changed, that they're just sleeping, that nothing's gone away. A Buddhist funeral, conversely, we would follow somebody into the crematorium, or in Asia have an open pyre burning of the body. You see the dissolution. So this is a fundamental cultural difference, but it's true of all cultures. We tend not to be with things as they are. We are with things as we wish them to be for as long as reality allows that. And when that changes, we suffer. So this is the first two perspectives. The third one is that things don't have to be that way. Cessation is possible. We can step out of this pattern of seeing and treating things other than they are by doing just that, which is the fourth noble truth, which is to say, if we have correct view, there's 8 points actually, but the first one is correct view. And if you're ever reading Buddhist literature, you'll note quickly that we love lists. The four noble truths, the 3 marks of existence, the eightfold path, the 250 precepts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Really, if you look at a Buddhist list, the Buddha always taught in a way that is this. If you can get the first one, you've got what he's trying to say. But if his audience didn't get it, he'd give a second and a third and a fourth. And if you materialize or actualize or realize the meaning of any of these points on a list, supposedly you get all of them. So I always stop as a Zen practitioner at the very first of the eightfold path. Marga literally is the word, it means path, which is to say that we follow the Buddhist perspective like this. The problem, the origins or roots of the problem, the fact that there's deliverance from the problem, and here's how. And here's how is simply this: correct view. See things as they are rather than they are not, and respond to them and act with them in kind, in accord with that reality. So when we talk about how Buddhism is meant to respond to the world, we first have to understand this, that we fundamentally see human existence, sentient existence, as entailing to a large degree problems. And this is why we meditate, because we're trying to correct our view, which corrects our actions. We correct our presuppositions and therefore engage the world through a lens of acceptance and surrender. And we have a lot less problems when we do that. So part of engaging the world through a Zen perspective is not just to ignore things. We don't really talk about detachment in Zen. If anything, we talk about attachment, engagement, delving further and further and further into the experience of our life, bringing everything into such an embrace that we become non-separate, non-distinct from it and from other suffering. But there's no way that's not problematic to exactingly spell out how to do that, or when to do that, or to what degree we do that. See, if we did that, we wouldn't be talking about liberation or freedom, which is what happens when we have correct view. We're no longer bound to our incorrect assumptions that create suffering. So Buddhist attainment, Buddhist enlightenment is being free to move about the world, if you will. So we don't define how to do that. We give you the tools to realize this wisdom in your life, to make wise decisions that affect the world in positive ways in your life without perpetuating the cycle of suffering through incorrect or errant assumptions, which, by the way, the question mentioned Maya, which is illusion, which is to say the world as it is not. So the fundamental Buddhist practice is to overcome the world as it is not, be with it as it is, and do what you can within that, within this realm of freedom and lack of suffering, lack of heaviness coming from that.
Thank you. If you're okay with it, we have the Reverend Dr. Vern Barnet on the line, and he has messaged me. He has a comment.
I would
He
love
would
a
like,
comment from Vern.
I thought you would.
First of all, let me just say what a pleasure it is to hear you teach again. You always have a fresh way of explaining these ancient and profound, and one might almost say eternal teachings, but maybe eternal is the wrong word to use for a Buddhist discussion. I wanted to just mention that I have been rereading a book by a Nobel Prize winner in the field of economy, but he's not an economist, he's a psychologist. And the book is called Thinking Fast and Slow. And it's a 400-some page book. And at the very end of the book, he turns toward how we might best live our lives. And the intriguing experiments that I wanted to mention to you and ask for any comments you might have about them show that he identifies two different kinds of selves: the remembered self and the experiencing self. And what is so paradoxical about his research and discoveries, this is very Western, has nothing to do with Zen, at least as he presents it. And that is, if people experience great suffering for a period of time, but the suffering diminishes, and they compare that with an even greater or a much lesser experience of suffering, but it increases toward the very end, then asked which experience they would prefer, it is the experience where the suffering is greater, but they remember it being less. So I'm wondering if, whether or not you've encountered this research, if you might have any comments about the remembered versus the experienced self as a way of further elucidating the Buddhist teaching of no self.
Absolutely. I think that's a great perspective, Vern. Thank you for that. We would look at all self concepts as somewhat problematic. We can even get attached to the concept of no self. So talk about remembered self, experienced self, no self. And really, I think these are the trends that the Buddha was identifying when he was pointing out the problems of dukkha, that we see things as they are rather than they are not. Let me erase that. We see things as they are not rather than they are. You talk about this remembering self as looking at the most recent experience and sort of foregoing the reality of that. That's how we move through the world all the time, right? We talk about being twice bitten in romance and things like this. We forget how things might realistically be through responding with desire, which again is part of that dukkha thing that Jay has brought up in the comments, this suffering pattern of being, that we are not simply with things as they are. When we conceptualize our experience, which is to say, take it out of our momentary experience, it tends to be anything other than it is. When we talk about impermanence, we know that nothing is impermanent, including these brains and their products. Almost all memory is flawed. That's why we know in eyewitness accounts, sort of what really should be the least accurate testimony in court, we sometimes give more credence than it should, which is an eyewitness experience. We see the world as we wish it to be rather than it typically is. So Buddhism would recognize that broadly, but then say, let's put that down through meditation and try to cultivate a type of mind that abides in the nowness of experience, that doesn't build up too many constructs or concepts about the past or presuppositions about the future, and allows our experience to be exactly as it is. And what you identified there is the fundamental reason for practice and what practice is itself. taking refuge in this moment, being with this moment completely, in spite of having to live in the world where we often know the running balance of our bank account so that we can pay the bills and plan to have the lights on for tomorrow. I think that's a fundamental quandary that people have when we talk about being completely in the moment, surrendering to things completely as they are. We can't forgo being human. We can't forgo having memories and making them more fond or more foul than they perhaps were at the time. That's what it is to be human. That's what poetry and literature and all these things are built out of. But we try to balance that as Buddhists with this perpetual injection of reality as it is in the moment through meditation to give it some balance. And that's what it's about. It's not about renunciation, giving up this very, I would say, delicate and beautiful mode of existence, which is humanity. Our typical patterns of thinking and remembering and projecting, it's not giving that up. We can't do it if we tried, but it's about balancing it with a concentrated form of attentiveness that perhaps takes more refuge in experience than remembering. So if we're going to give one credence over the other, we uphold remembering, we uphold conceptualization as something that is potentially contributing to our enjoyment and experience of life and is a wonderful thing, but we defer to the cogs of reality as it is. Because when we put them in competition, conceptual cogs always get bent and moved out of the way by the cogs of reality. So I hope that's speaking towards the arena of what we're offering.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
I think we have another question here from Dorothy. So how does the second noble truth relate to science and entropy versus negentropy? Is it dialectical, paradoxical? I would say that Buddhism embraces science as an observational discipline. You know, we don't really have a lot of, there's so many people that want to post like these Albert Einstein quotes that the religion of the future will look something like Buddhism, and we take things out of context and yada, yada, yada. Zen has as many problems as any other religion can have when engaging modernity or post-modernity. It's not something that stands on an island of its own. It's a particularly unique or accurate tradition. In fact, you'll find voices that are quickly dismissive of science and observational insights from disciplines outside of religion as you would anywhere else. And you'll find people that are quick to embrace it, particularly Westerners. So I should say that my perspective as a longtime convert, but a convert nonetheless, shouldn't be taken up as necessarily exhaustive or authoritative on the matter, because I get into enough bouts with my ecclesiastical superiors to say that that's not true. But fundamentally, I would say my experience of the Zen tradition is that we defer to any collective observation. We tend to try to correct our tradition. While not having ongoing revelation, if you will, we're open to whatever experience is rendering in the moment. So we change with the times. We go with the flow. We examine everything under the same penetrating inquiry that we uphold in our meditation. And in fact, in Buddhism, we have a sutra that's often misused, but sometimes accurately used, called the Kalama Sutra, wherein the Buddha is coming to preach in his mendicant way to a group of people called the Kalamas, as he was doing throughout the Indian countryside, if you will. And the Kalamas lived in sort of an area of high levels of trade and interengagement with the various subcultures that were around. And basically they meet the Buddha and his disciples at the gate and say, look, dude, what are you selling? We don't need it. We probably already have it. What's your elevator pitch? You know, so this is my paraphrasing a scripture, a sacred Buddhist text. And the Buddha says, well, hear me out, O Kalamas, hear me out, people. What I am here to do is to not tell you to accept anything because I'm saying it or because it's been written down in your holy books or handed down on the word of your elders, but rather I invite you to take up any teaching that's offered, anything that I have to give especially, and put it under scrutiny, examine it. If it seems logical, if it holds up to rationality, then perhaps try it out, put it to work in your life. And if you find that it's good and beneficial for the one and all, then and only then accept it and live to it. So that's how we would engage any scientific or religious or philosophical concept or construct. We're going to examine it through this light of Zazen, through this meditative inquiry. We're going to let it hold up to our rational mind or not, try it out in our experience, and if it works, we live with it. That's what it's always about, deferring to reality. And ideally, science, objective, inquiry is doing just that. It's observations about reality that you can defer to or not, but they will affect you just the same. So Buddhism would accept these things, generally speaking.
We have about 9 minutes or so. Does anyone have another question, one last question probably, that they would like to ask or comment? I do see there was a request for some recommended reading or websites you might direct people to. If you could put those in the chat before you log off.
Unfortunately, there's not a lot of great individual websites that are exhaustive. We used to have one called Sweeping Zen, but it's gone the way of Internet Archive. A few books that I would recommend, and perhaps Geneva can write them in the chat. I always send people to Zen Master Seung San's Compass of Zen. I think it's a fairly fair and accessible text. It's large, but it's accessible, that talks about the evolution of the original Buddhist school into Buddhism and gives an introduction to a lot of the scriptures. And it is fairly non-sectarian, if you will. Of course, there's the seminal text by Shunryu Suzuki Roshi, which is Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which is a series of lectures, a rather brief text that has its own life. I've found in my own practice, the more I go back and read the book, the more life it takes on, which is informed by my experience of the tradition. Another one that's a great text that actually gives some suggestion for practice as you go along is Zen Philosophy, Zen Practice, I think is what it's called, by Thich Thien An, who is a Vietnamese Zen master. So with those three books, we get a Korean perspective, a Japanese perspective, and a Vietnamese perspective. And each of these gentlemen actually knew each other and were missionaries that came to America to teach Zen. But if you're looking for some practice, Zen Philosophy, Zen Practice by Thich Thien An gives an overview of the tradition and then gives you some things to do. And remember, Zen is always about doing. We can conceptualize and philosophize all we want, but if we're not doing it, if we're not practicing it, it's not Zen. And that's a Thich Thien An, Geneva. Nyat Han was his Dharma brother, monastery brother, but also an interesting voice. I would say that Thich Nhat Hanh is a very prolific author, generally recognized as being a little bit outside of the Zen stream. He does belong technically to the Vietnamese Zen school, but he really has become a revolutionary himself and defined his own school. So while his books are great, they're not representative of the wider Zen tradition.
I had a question.
Yeah.
So can you explain how the process of meditation leads to a decrease in suffering?
Absolutely.
And maybe a clearer worldview?
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about clearing up our worldview, we're fundamentally talking about clearing up conceptions. So what we have to do in meditation is sort through conceptions versus experience, and then also at some point contend with the reality that our experience is always conditioned through concepts. Ideally in Zen, romantically in Zen, we're stripping all of that away and being with the most bare experience of reality possible. We have these little breakthrough moments called kensho, which is an awakening, enlightenment experiences where everything suddenly becomes clear. It's poetry. You have experiences in meditation, but we invite people not to get too attached to them. The practice of meditation in a way is making destructive inquiry. So we're taking layers off from our experience of reality, if you will. There's a number of preliminary practices that go into this. You don't just sit down and do Zen meditation necessarily. We would probably start with some of the early practices that the Buddha gave that are today under the Theravada tradition. Some of the fundamental ways of meditation are shamatha, vipassana, and metta. Shamatha means stopping, so quieting down the mind. And Zen, we recognize that you never cease the activity of the mind. To be alive is to be thinking to some real degree, but we're able to let it settle a little bit so that we can separate our experience of selfhood from our experience of internal commentary and dialogue, so that we can examine them with some degree of objectivity. So shamatha practice might begin with counting your breaths, just making some separation between awareness and reaction, if you will, giving ourselves some silence, some space for consideration. So you can, there's practices focusing on a candlelight, breathing in and out, counting your breaths up to 10 and then backwards. And if you don't deviate from that process, then maybe you can go on to the next thing. So in other words, there's a lot of preliminary practice of just sitting down, quieting down, and paying attention. And eventually that evolves into the Vipassana practice. Vipassana broadly means inquiry, which means now we've separated our meditation from our thought stream sufficiently so that we can make inquiry of the thought stream itself, the internal reality, and the external reality. The word Dharma is interesting, and one of the ways we become a Buddhist is by taking refuge in the Dharma. And Dharma has a lot of meanings. Some of my favorites are internal qualities and external phenomena. So we take refuge in things as they are so that we can examine them as they are. And what happens when we do this reductive or destructive process of meditation is we start to shed assumptions and conceptual frameworks that previously would have put us into this cycle of creating suffering. So in other words, when we start taking refuge and shielding ourselves from reality with reality itself, we are no longer engaging this suffering process, ideally. We again create this gap for response to reality rather than conceptual reaction or patterns or habit karma of reacting to reality. Really, meditation is about simply learning to be with things as they are through the thinnest conceptual lens as possible, so that we can again take refuge in that objective experiential nature of reality and respond to it in accord. So the reduction of suffering in Buddhism is really being in harmony with the natural world, the natural laws of how things work, not fighting against them because they will win every time. So when we strip away these flawed concepts and abide with things as they are, we tend to respond to things as they are, and therefore the suffering naturally falls away, in a nutshell. I mean, there's a lot that goes into that. Typically, before someone becomes a Zen teacher, they'll engage various processes for 20 or even 30 years to come to a place where they can guide someone for 20 or 30 years. So that's very high level, but that is generally how it kind of works. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you very much. I think my question would have been something like Dorothy's question, which is that what if reality is depressing? But I think I need more Buddhist practice before I can get to that stage.
Yeah, depressing is a concept, you know, kind of to what Vern was talking about, our remembering experience. You know, I like to go interdisciplinary in my study of religion. And one of my favorite voices that I'm re-engaging right now is Viktor Frankl. And some of you probably know Viktor Frankl was a psychiatrist that went through the Holocaust. And he writes, I think his book, the main book he wrote is Mankind's Search for Meaning. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, because I sometimes mix up the title, but I think that's right. And he gives his experience of being in a concentration camp and shows how the remembrance of that experience was simultaneously liberating for some people and destructive to others, and understandably so. And I think we could say that about everything in reality. You know, some people are just torn apart by what we would, you know, relatively say are the most minute experiences. We can get depressed and into these conceptual ruts very easily. Some people have a little bit more resilience, if you will, and it might take bigger things for their experience. But depression is a concept, and it's a relative concept. So if we're being depressed by reality, we probably need to work more to strip away our constructs and concepts that are interpreting reality. So in a Zen perspective, the Kensho, the awakening, the enlightenment experience is really abiding in a place of neutrality or equanimity, where we can be with the sine waves of happiness, depression, elation, despair that are intrinsic to human being. And in that sine wave, find some solace in this sort of middle ground that sees this bigger picture of the ups and downs and is with them for what they are, and ideally stops defining them so much. So typically when we're depressed by what we find by reality, it's our interpretive schema. You know, we know biologically, for instance, in psychology, that there is no such thing as stress that exists outside of interpretation. In counseling, we talk about the interpretive stress response. You know, depression is very much tied up with the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system and the interpretation of phenomena. So Buddhism is trying to step back in our practice from interpretation as much as is possible, so that we can see things clearly and make responses, to make choices that are not just reactionary through a construct or a concept that might give us depression above all else. And in psychotherapy, which Buddhism is very much influenced by and influencing in the West, we would look at that lens as a cognitive distortion.
Thank you.
Sure.
Do you have time to take that last question from Dorothy in the chat?
Which one is it, Geneva?
How do I defer to collective observation when I live in a world where leaders are lying and the truth is being distorted for political purposes?
Same as it's ever been, although I think in the age of telecommunications, we see it in a more gross manner than perhaps we have in the past, and it's definitely at home right now. How do you defer to collective observation? That's not a tenet of Buddhism. So let me say that. That was in response to, how a Buddhist would engage science. We can defer to that scientific collective observation, if you will, because good science is an observation that's replicable, that other people can see the same results from. And I think that that's true. We live in a world of alternative facts, supposedly, right? And there's a lot of ways to look at that, but I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole of talking about gaslighting and people making up and accepting other realities, but this is what we human beings always do. So we go back to the advice of the Kalama Sutra, which is to strip away as much as possible, tested by reason and rationality within the group that we have accessible, the collective that we have accessible. And if it's good and true and to the benefit of the one and the many, then live to it. If not, Buddhism gives us the freedom of inquiry that can reject anything that comes up. So we don't have to just defer to something because it's being practiced by the masses, right? A scientific insight that is touted to be scientific simply because the funders want a particular result and publish it in a journal that they may also own and control the editing of doesn't make it true. That makes it propaganda, So just because something is widely distributed and seemingly collective and seemingly observational and seemingly tested and verified by multiple parties doesn't mean that's the case. So collective observation is just that. You defer to reality as it's experienced by yourself and others who are committed to breaking through the conceptual barriers that interpret our experience in ways other than it perhaps is organically, if that makes some sense, I hope.
And I think there was just one last, Mary was asking for clarification on term you used, Vipassana.
Oh, Vipassana. Vipassana is the second mode of inquiry or meditation that the Buddha taught, which means insight meditation. So it's making direct question of reality when we settle down our mind. And by the way, as sort of a closing comment, I want to say that the Buddha was renowned for teaching 3 modes of meditation: shamatha, vipassana, and metta. Shamatha is that stopping meditation, all those disciplines that quiet the mind, that allow the mind stream to settle. Vipassana is making inquiry in the open space or the space that opens up in that settling of the mind. And finally, metta, it means loving kindness. In other words, it means give yourself a break, give yourself some levity, and everybody else in the process. Because this is difficult, it's convoluted, and it's prone to revision as we go on. If we get stuck in any construct, even a Buddhist construct, and it brushes up against a reality that is other than that is, guess what? We're still going to suffer. So reality is always changing. The Dharma wheel is always turning, as we say. So we have to give ourselves and everybody else a little bit of a break. And so there's specific teachings in Buddhism about how to cultivate a positive, loving, kind regard for other beings. And that's an interesting topic in its own. But I just remind people, give yourself a gap, a space, a break, and everybody else in the process, and it becomes a little bit easier to navigate this practice.
Mary also was asking if he has a book or a website. Oh, I think he means you.
Oh,
do you have a book? I don't believe that you do.
On books, my students are always pestering for this, and I quote E.Q. Sojun, famous Japanese Zen master, who said, "Yesterday's wisdom is tomorrow's stupidity." So I'm not prone to putting things down into print. I do have a blog where I opine frequently. It's errantabbot.tumblr.com, ERRANTABBOT.tumblr, TUMBLR.com. Or maybe there's an E at the end. Geneva, you probably know how to spell Tumblr.
I definitely don't.
Let me look here if I can type it in to everybody. And that will, how do I respond?
I am not on Tumblr.
I don't know why I am.
I think they remove all of the vowels. Something like that.
Let's see. I think this is right. I'm the only errant abbot on the website nonetheless, so it might be. One of those.
I think it's without the E.
I think you're right.
I just Googled.
Internet spellings.
I know I knew they removed a vowel. Great. Well, thank you so much. I want to be mindful of your time. But if you have any last comments or thoughts that you would like to close with, or.
Yeah, I just thank you all for coming here and being in dialogue. It's been very enjoyable for me, and this is the Buddhist practice. This is what we do. We're in dialogue, often not so fast, but thank you for doing that. We sometimes say that these engagements plant seeds, karmic seeds that eventually have to ripen. So may we all become awakened, liberated individuals at some point in the future. Hopefully you before me.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to the Most Venerable Sunyananda. Thank you to all of you who joined us today. And I hope you will attend future events with the Interfaith Center. We do have one coming up this Friday as a response to the racial injustice and the sort of uprising we're currently seeing, called Reaching Racial Relevance Through Overcoming Racial Numbness. And on Sunday, if you are interested in other contemplative perspectives, the Reverend Rob Carr will be doing a presentation on centering prayer. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope to see you all again soon. And this presentation is on Facebook Live, and I will also edit to YouTube if anybody would like to share it, as long as that's okay with you.
Sure.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you to all. Hope you have a great afternoon.